Have you ever found yourself in that situation? It's probably familiar. You've just made a big decision, right? Maybe it's finally buying that new car you spent months researching, or perhaps, committing to a career path after years of thinking about it. Or maybe it's even just picking a new favorite coffee brand,
Right.
and then those little doubts start creeping in, as they always do. And you catch yourself defending that choice, like really fiercely, not just to other people, but even inside your own head. It's almost like your brain is working overtime trying to convince you it was the only logical option all along. Or perhaps you've seen this in someone else, watching them cling, maybe almost irrationally, to a decision, even when the objective evidence seems to suggest, well, it might have been flawed.
Today, we're going to take a deep dive into exactly this. It's a fascinating and, frankly, incredibly common phenomenon. We're exploring the cognitive bias right at the heart of it. Choice supportive bias.
That's exactly right. And choice supportive bias, or CSB as we'll probably call it, it isn't just, a simple preference for what you picked. It's actually this powerful subconscious tendency we all seem to have. At its core, it kind of compels us to retroactively paint the option we selected in this overwhelmingly positive light. And at the same time, often quite subtly, we start downplaying the benefits of the alternatives we rejected, or maybe even exaggerating their drawbacks a little. You could think of it as our mind's tireless effort to justify our own decisions, to make them make sense after the fact, even when maybe objective evidence might suggest we could have actually made a better choice. It's all about building a consistent story around our actions.
Right. So our mission, our goal for this deep dive is to really unpack what this bias is. We want to delve into its definition, how it subtly warps our perceptions. Then we'll explore why. Why are our brains wired to do this? We'll look at the deep psychological reasons that make it so pervasive. After that, we'll examine how it impacts, well, pretty much everything, from our daily shopping habits and our personal relationships to, and this might be surprising, even the rigorous world of scientific research. And crucially, we'll look at what we can actually do about it. How can we recognize it? How can we mitigate its effects? The aim is to foster better, more objective, and genuinely informed decision-making in, well, all parts of life. We're drawing insights today from a really comprehensive article on this by Faster Capital, and also a particularly insightful research paper from Accountability and Research by Kafai Marhamati and Karib Zadeh. That one really zeroes in on the implications in science. Okay, so settle in. Let's truly unpack this psychological anchor and see just how deeply it shapes not only how we remember the past, but how we experience our present realities. So let's start right at the core. What is choice supportive bias, really? Our source material describes it as, well, a cognitive bias, one that compels us, often completely unconsciously, to justify the decisions we've made. And this tendency, it becomes particularly noticeable when we run into information or evidence that suggests maybe, just maybe, we could have made a better choice, or perhaps should have. It's a truly fascinating part of human psychology, isn't it? Because it really shows how our memories and perceptions aren't static recordings. They can be actively altered, reshaped, reconstructed to back up the choices we've already made. Even if those choices, looking back objectively, were kind of flawed from the beginning. It's like our brain is trying to protect its own past performance.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that the psychological roots run deep. They're embedded in some very fundamental human needs and the way our minds process things. One of the big drivers is something called cognitive dissonance. You've probably heard of it. It's that really uncomfortable mental tension, that kind of internal clash we feel when we hold two or more contradictory beliefs or ideas at the same time. So imagine you buy an expensive new phone, right? And then later you read some reviews highlighting significant flaws. That creates dissonance. I'm smart, I made a good choice, versus, uh-oh, this expensive thing has problems. Choice supportive bias then swoops in. It's our brain's clever automatic fix to ease that discomfort. By kind of subtly tweaking our perception of the phone and our choice to buy it, it aligns everything with our self-perception as a good decision maker. It restores that psychological balance, smooths over the conflict. Basically, it makes us feel better about what we did.
Ah, okay. So it's a way to avoid that awkward feeling of having messed up.
Precisely. And closely tied to that is the need for self-concept maintenance. People just, well, we like to believe we're competent, rational individuals, that we generally make sound choices. So when we face evidence that contradicts that maybe that expensive purchase really wasn't worth it, or that career path isn't quite what we hoped at Keel, like a direct hit to our self-esteem, our self-image feels threatened. Choice supportive bias then acts like a psychological defense shield. It helps us maintain that positive self-image by conveniently reframing those decisions in a much more favorable light. We're essentially protecting our ego, convincing ourselves, and often others too, that we were right all along, or at least, that our choice was justifiable, given the circumstances.
Right, like rewriting history a little bit in our favor.
In a way, yes. And a huge, often really underestimated part of this is the malleable nature of memory. Our memories, they aren't like perfect video recordings we just replay. That's a common misconception. Instead, memory is an active reconstruction process. Every single time we recall something, we're actually rebuilding that memory and that rebuilding process. It's heavily influenced by our current emotions, our beliefs, and yes, our biases, like CSB. CSB shows how memory serves this crucial function beyond just storing facts. It helps us maintain a coherent, consistent story about our decisions. This often involves subtly glossing over the negatives of the path we took and maybe embellishing the positives a bit. It's not usually a conscious manipulation. It's more like our brain trying to tell a consistent and frankly flattering story about our past actions, which means, crucially, that what we remember about a past choice might actually be significantly different from the objective reality of that moment.
Wow, that's a powerful point. So you might genuinely believe your decision-making process was super thorough, analytical, totally rational, even if, back when you were actually making the choice, it felt kind of impulsive or maybe just a gut feeling. Our memories then actively help us build that rational narrative afterwards, making us feel better about the path we took, even kind of rewriting the context of our own choice. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but for our memories.
Definitely. And from a behavioral economics viewpoint, this ties directly into what's often called post-purchase rationalization. You see this all the time in consumer behavior. After someone makes a purchase, especially a significant one, they tend to unconsciously overvalue the benefits of the thing they chose. And conversely, they undervalue the benefits of the alternatives they decided against. Think about someone who splurges on a really high-end designer handbag. Afterwards, they might focus intensely on the amazing craftsmanship, the durability of the leather, the perceived status it conveys, while subtly dismissing how impractical the cost was or the fact that a much cheaper bag could do the exact same job functionally. This kind of thinking can lead to strong consumer loyalty, but it might be based more on this internal need for self-justification than on any truly objective assessment of the product's value or performance. It's not just that they like it, they need to believe they made the right call, and their thinking adjusts accordingly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources really dive deep into how CSB specifically distorts our perception and memory. It's not just a vague feeling, it shows up in very specific, almost measurable ways. It really demonstrates the power of this bias. First off, there's the basic phenomenon of memory distortion itself. After we make a choice, we consistently tend to remember our chosen option as being better, more attractive, or more effective than it actually seemed at the time we were deciding. And conversely, we remember the options we rejected as being worse, less appealing, or less effective than they might have objectively been. For example, think about that new car you bought. You might remember its performance, how smooth the ride is, or its cool design much more favorably after owning it for a few months, compared to your more balanced, objective assessment right after the test drive when you were still comparing it to other cars. The memories literally shift to match the choice you made.
That makes sense. Your memory kind of reinforces the decision.
Exactly. Then there's selective recall. Our minds basically become these highly efficient but biased filters. We tend to remember mostly the benefits, the advantages, the positive stuff about the option we chose, while conveniently forgetting, or just ignoring, the good points or positive features of the alternative that we passed up. Going back to the car example, after buying that specific model, you might vividly recall its great fuel efficiency and how people complimented its style. But you might completely forget or really downplay those pre-purchase worries you had about its high maintenance costs, or maybe its slightly lower safety rating, or how much roomier that competitor's model felt inside.
So you cherry pick the memories that make you feel good about the choice.
Pretty much. And this selective process can even go as far as an actual distortion of facts. It's not just about feelings. Sometimes the hard details or objective attributes of the options get inaccurately remembered or mixed up in a way that specifically makes the chosen option look better. Imagine a high school student who's thrilled to get into their top choice university. Later on, they might genuinely recall that their chosen university had a higher national ranking or a more famous department than it actually did at the exact time they made their decision. They subtly inflate its status in their memory to justify how committed they were. The memory literally edits the facts to fit the narrative. I made a brilliant choice.
Wow, that's quite subtle.
It is. And what about source amnesia? This one's particularly fascinating. It involves forgetting where the information that influenced your decision actually came from. This can then lead to this inflated sense that you were solely responsible for the brilliant decision, based on your own independent judgment. For instance, maybe a friend's rave recommendation or a specific online review was the key factor that pushed you to buy a particular smartphone. But over time, you might completely forget that crucial external influence. Instead, you genuinely start to believe your choice was based only on your own thorough, objective research and great judgment. You basically erase the external help to take full, independent credit for what you now see as a really good decision.
You forget the prompt
Yeah.
and just remember the outcome you liked.
Kind of, yeah. And emotional coloring is another huge factor. The emotions you felt at the time you made the choice can really color your memories of it afterwards, making them seem way more positive than they might have been objectively. Think about a honeymoon location. That beach resort might be remembered with this incredibly warm, rosy glow, right? Simply because of the overwhelmingly positive emotions tied to the honeymoon itself, the romance, the excitement, the joy. This emotional halo then spills over onto the memory of the place, making it seem objectively superior to other travel spots, regardless of its actual facilities or weather. The powerful emotion of the event bleeds into and enhances the memory of the choice.
Right, the feeling gets attached to the place itself.
Exactly. And there's also a big element of ego defense going on. To protect our self-esteem, to reinforce that image of ourselves as rational decision makers, we might subtly alter our memory of the decision-making process itself. We make it seem much more deliberate, more exhaustive, more logical than it really was at the time. This might involve overestimating how much information we actually considered, or how many alternatives we seriously weighed, or even how certain we felt when we pulled the trigger. It's all about convincing ourselves after the fact that we were totally in control and perfectly rational the whole time.
Making ourselves look good in our own memory's eye.
You got it. And closely related is hindsight bias. Looking back at a past decision, we often fall into this trap of thinking the outcome was somehow inevitable, that our past choice was the only sensible one we could have possibly made. Even if, back then, the choice felt really uncertain, maybe stressful, and there were lots of other plausible paths we could have taken. We tell ourselves, well, of course that was the right way to go, making the messy past seem neat and the chosen outcome seem preordained. This really stops us from learning from the true uncertainty of past choices.
Yeah, the I knew it all along effect.
Precisely. And finally, a really common one is selective information gathering, which ties directly into confirmation bias. Once we've made a decision, we develop this strong, often unconscious tendency to actively seek out, notice, and really favor information that supports our choice. And just as importantly, we tend to avoid or dismiss information that contradicts it. You see this crystal clear in things like brand loyalty. Consumers who've picked a certain brand, say for their phone or their car, might only pay attention to positive reviews, glowing testimonials, or success stories about their brand. They completely filter out negative feedback, critical comparisons, or news about superior features from competitors. They essentially curate their own information bubble to keep reinforcing their past choice.
It's absolutely crucial to grasp these intricate memory distortions. Because our memories, they aren't just passive files storing the past. They're incredibly active participants in reinforcing the path we've chosen. They are dynamic things, constantly being reshaped. Not just to store information, but to build and maintain this coherent, ego-protective story. One that helps us preserve consistency and feel good about the decisions we've made. And this fundamental truth about how memory works. It has profound implications for how we understand our past and, by extension, how we perceive our present reality.
Okay, so as we've established, this isn't just some quirky mental habit or a minor internal trick. Choice supportive bias has real, tangible, often far-reaching impacts across our lives. It shapes everything from our simple daily habits to our most significant life choices. Let's look at how it actually plays out in different real-world scenarios. Yeah, let's definitely start with consumer behavior. That's where this bias is often incredibly vivid and easy to see. We touched on post-purchase rationalisation earlier, right? Where consumers convince themselves a product is superior after they've bought it. Think about someone who invests in a really expensive, top-of-the-line kitchen appliance, maybe a fancy fridge or oven. Afterwards, they might spend ages meticulously detailing its advanced features, emphasizing how energy efficient it is, justifying the high cost by focusing on its supposed longevity or build quality. All while subtly overlooking the fact that a much cheaper, simpler model might have done the job perfectly well for their actual needs. They need to believe that big expenditure was the smartest possible choice.
Right, you have to justify the splurge.
Exactly. And this leads directly into powerful brand loyalty and endorsement. A consumer who picks, say, a specific smartphone brand isn't just satisfied with it. They become highly likely to keep buying from that same brand over and over again. They genuinely start to believe in its unmatched features, its superior software ecosystem, maybe its design, and they actively disregard what competitors are offering, even if those competitors have made huge leaps in innovation. They become, often without realizing it, an advocate for their chosen brand, which, in turn, influences customer satisfaction and reviews. Buyers caught up in CSD might write those glowing 5-star reviews, really talking up the product to justify their own choice. They might overlook or minimize flaws that objectively probably warrant some criticism. This self-justification directly impacts their reported satisfaction levels and consequently how others perceive the product's quality.
So those online reviews might not always be as objective as we think.
Probably not always, no. The bias also strongly influences repeat purchases. It makes us much more likely to buy the same things again and again, often based purely on a deeply held belief in their superiority, without any fresh objective comparison. Take coffee, like you mentioned earlier. Someone who always buys a specific premium coffee brand might genuinely believe it just tastes inherently better than anything else out there. Even if they've never actually done a blind taste test to confirm that belief objectively, it's simply the belief, reinforced by their past choice and the good feelings associated with it, that drives the repeat purchase, not necessarily a rigorous comparison of taste or value.
Interesting. And does this scale up?
Oh, definitely. On a broader scale, consumers often use their choices to influence others. They'll share their positive experiences, framing them as undeniable proof of quality, which highlights its impact on social proof. This can create a powerful ripple effect where the bias spreads through friend groups or online communities. And collectively, this bias can significantly affect market trends. Think about the rise of electric vehicles. Now, obviously, there are many legitimate reasons for this shift: environmental concerns, technological advances, government incentives. But it's also powerfully reinforced by the collective, shared rationalizations of the choices made by early adopters. They tend to focus on the instant acceleration, the quiet ride, the low running costs, and maybe downplay things like range anxiety, charging time, or the current limits of charging infrastructure. This creates this strong positive feedback loop that helps accelerate wider adoption. This bias also fuels resistance to change. It makes consumers stick with a service provider they've used for years, maybe an internet provider or a bank, even when better or cheaper alternatives emerge. Why? Because of their past choice justification and the mental effort they already invested in that initial decision. It's easier to stick with the familiar justified choice.
And what about money? Does it affect financial decisions?
Absolutely. In financial decision-making, choice-supportive bias can have really significant, sometimes quite harmful effects. It can lead people to hold on to investments like stocks or mutual funds for much longer than is advisable purely because of the initial decision they made to invest. They might overlook clear market signals to sell, clinging to the belief that their original investment choice was fundamentally sound, even as circumstances change dramatically against them. It's that deep reluctance to admit their initial assessment might have been wrong, or at least not right anymore.
Wow. It's fascinating how deep this runs in our economic lives. But as you said, it's not just about products and money, right? This bias also profoundly shapes our relationships and social circles. It changes how we see the people closest to us. For instance, in romantic relationships, choice-supportive bias can lead to this kind of idealized view of one's partner. It makes us unconsciously overlook their flaws or maybe minimize them and focus almost entirely on their positive qualities. You might find yourself justifying a partner's occasional jealousy or overprotective streak as just caring deeply, rather than seeing it potentially as controlling behavior. It's not malicious, usually. It's just our brain working hard to affirm the really big choice we've made in committing to that person. It creates a more harmonious internal story. The danger, of course, is when this idealization stops us from addressing real problems or seeing the relationship and our partner clearly.
That makes a lot of sense. You want to believe you chose well.
Exactly. And similarly, in friendship choices, this bias can show up as this exaggerated sense of loyalty. We might find ourselves fiercely defending a friend's questionable actions to others, not necessarily because we genuinely believe they're 100% right, but because defending them reinforces our own decision to be their friend, to keep them in our inner circle. It's our brain saying, look, I chose this person, they're important to me, so they must be fundamentally good, and I need to stand by them. This can sometimes, unfortunately, lead to enabling bad behavior or overlooking problematic patterns, all in the name of loyalty fueled by CSB.
So it affects who we stick by.
Definitely.
And think about group affiliations, whether it's a social club, a professional organization, maybe your favorite sports team, or even a political party you identify with. Members often powerfully rationalize the group's decisions, its actions, maybe even overlook its clear shortcomings, all to strengthen their own identity as part of that collective. The desire to belong and to justify our association with the group can sometimes outweigh a critical individual assessment. We become emotionally invested in the group being right because our own sense of self is tied up with it.
You defend the team, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Even in everyday workplace dynamics, choice supportive bias plays a subtle but really significant role. Employees might justify their choice of company or maybe sticking with a specific long-term project by focusing heavily on the positives. The culture is great, my colleagues are supportive, we're working on something innovative, even if, deep down, maybe the job isn't truly meeting their long-term career goals. Or perhaps the project they're defending is clearly struggling or misguided. They've invested time and energy, and their brain wants to validate that investment, make it feel worthwhile.
And extending beyond just us as individuals, this bias clearly impacts much bigger things, like business decisions and legal judgments, often with really significant real-world consequences. In a business context, think about executives or managers. They might continue to irrationally pour resources into a failing project, or keep pushing a struggling product line, or stick to a flawed strategic plan, simply because they were the ones who initially championed it or made the decision to implement it. Instead of objectively looking at the data, acknowledging the shortcomings, cutting their losses, and changing course, they kind of dig in their heels. They escalate their commitment. This can lead to huge financial losses, wasted time and effort, and missed opportunities for the entire organization. It's a classic trap, where past commitment overrides present rational assessment.
The sunk cost fallacy, but driven by this bias too.
Exactly, they feed into each other. And in the legal world, think about legal judgments and the role of jurors. After going through a difficult trial and finally reaching a verdict, jurors often become even more convinced of its correctness afterwards. They might unconsciously start to selectively remember and really emphasize the pieces of evidence that strongly support their decision, while maybe downplaying or forgetting evidence that pointed the other way. Regardless of whether that verdict was truly the most just outcome based on all the evidence, the very act of making that definitive decision seems to solidify their belief in it, making it much harder to reconsider or even acknowledge any lingering doubts. It's that post-decision reinforcement kicking in, potentially influencing how confident jurors feel about their incredibly important role in a legal outcome.
So really, what does this all mean? It seems like from the tiny choice of which coffee to buy, all the way up to the profound choice of a life partner or a critical business strategy, this bias isn't just watching from the sidelines. It's actively shaping our reality, it's influencing our future actions, and while sometimes it can anchor us to decisions that aren't actually serving us, or maybe aren't serving the bigger goals we think we have. It just highlights how dynamic and, frankly, how reconstructive our thinking processes really are.
Okay, so now let's peel back another layer. Let's look at the deeper psychological and scientific reasons why this bias is so incredibly common, so pervasive, and critically, let's explore how it can even impact the world of scientific inquiry itself. A field we often assume is purely objective, maybe totally immune to these kinds of human quirks. This brings us to something called the dual process theory and cognitive bias. It's a really foundational concept in cognitive psychology. This theory basically suggests that our thoughts and decisions come from two different interacting systems for processing information. First, there's the automatic system, often called System 1. The system is characterized by being fast, it's uncontrolled, effortless, associative, largely unconscious, and it operates on rules of thumb or heuristics. It's our gut reactions, our intuition, responsible for those quick judgments and immediate perceptions. Then there's the reflective system, or System 2. This system is the opposite. It's slow, controlled, effortful, deductive, conscious, and it follows rules logically. This is where we do our deliberate, rational thinking, complex problem solving, and conscious reasoning. Now, our sources highlight that many of our daily decisions, especially when we're rushed or overloaded with information, tend to rely heavily on that fast, unconscious System 1. While System 1 is super efficient for, say, survival instincts, it can unfortunately lead to systematic errors biases, like choice supportive bias. It lets us make a choice quickly, and then, just as quickly, rationalize it without too much effortful System 2 thinking.
So CSB is like a shortcut our brain takes in System 1.
In many ways, yes. A cognitive bias, then, is defined precisely as a systematic mistake of mind. It happens in our cognition, our recall, our reasoning, our decision-making. These aren't just random slip-ups. They are predictable, repeated patterns of irrationality that pop up in certain kinds of situations. Now, sometimes these biases can be useful, like for quickly detecting danger in our evolutionary past, allowing us to react fast. But they can unconsciously interfere exactly when we need rationality, objectivity, and careful deliberation the most. The trouble with CSB is that it operates largely in System 1, often bypassing that more critical, effortful System 2 analysis we think we're doing.
And what's particularly, well, sobering is what the research shows about how hard it is to get rid of these biases. Just being aware of them, it turns out, often isn't enough. Even actively trying to eliminate a bias from your thinking might not actually work effectively in practice. Our sources give a great illustration using hindsight bias, which seems to share some mechanisms with CSB. In a classic experiment back in 1977, Baruch Fischoff asked people to predict the results of some scientific research studies. One group just made predictions based on the descriptions. Another group was also asked to predict, but then they were given the actual results of the research, and they were explicitly told not to use that outcome information when making their prediction of what they would have thought beforehand. The striking finding. The group that was given the real outcome, even when told to ignore it, their predictions were significantly closer to the actual results. It shows just how incredibly difficult it is for our brains to truly ignore knowledge once we have it, once a decision is made or an outcome is known. Once that information is in our heads, it's almost impossible to fully unknow it. And it inevitably biases how we perceive the prior uncertainty.
That's a powerful demonstration. And another important finding from the research, supported by studies from folks like Loveton and Mather and Johnson back in the early 2000s, is that choice-supportive bias seems to be more predominant in older people. Now, this raises a particularly significant point when we think about science, because older, more experienced researchers typically hold substantial influence within the scientific community, right? They're often the ones involved in critical roles, deciding who gets grant funding, defining the big research projects, shaping the overall research agendas, leading major institutions and labs. So if CSB is indeed more prevalent in senior scientists, it could potentially have significant far-reaching impacts on the direction, the funding, the interpretation, and ultimately the overall integrity of scientific research worldwide. Their choices and how strongly they support those past choices carry enormous weight.
Wow, okay, that's where it gets really critical. Let's turn specifically to the role of choice in science and how choice-supportive bias can subtly, maybe insidiously creep into what we often imagine as this fortress of pure objectivity and unbiased searching for truth. It's a really eye-opening perspective on the human side of science.
Yeah, it really is. Scientific inquiry, maybe contrary to the popular image, is just profoundly permeated by the inherent role of choice. Scientists aren't simply robots following a strict protocol. They make absolutely fundamental choices at almost every stage of their work. And crucially, these choices are often underdetermined by the empirical evidence alone. What that means is the data itself doesn't always point to one single, clear, unambiguous path forward. There's room for judgment, for interpretation, for choice. Take research subject selection, for example. Just think about it. There are countless potential topics out there, an almost infinite number of questions we could investigate. But resources, time, money, people are always limited. So scientists must choose which specific topics they're going to study, which hypotheses they'll test, which phenomena they'll focus on observing. And this selection process, it's profoundly influenced by their goals, their underlying values, their training, and also by what their scientific community deems worth noting or significant at that time. As the philosopher Karl Popper famously put it, observation is always selective. It needs a chosen object, a definite task, an interest, a point of view, a problem. So right from the very first step, the scientific process involves a series of crucial choices, not just passive discovery.
So they're already filtering reality just by choosing what to look at.
Absolutely. Then we move to data treatment. This stage is just full of choices that are often far from simple or clear-cut. How much data do you actually need to be confident in your result? What's the best way to collect it? What level of accuracy is good enough? Should you repeat measurements? If so, how many times to be sure? Which specific data points, if any, should you discard as outliers or errors? And what criteria do you use for that deletion? Our sources emphasize that data from any experiment always has some inherent uncertainty. The experimenter ultimately has to choose a procedure, an accuracy level, a time frame, a cost they're willing to bear. And in many, many cases, there's no single perfect algorithm or objective rule dictating those choices.
So there's judgment involved at every step.
A huge amount.
Yeah.
And philosophers of science like Helen Longino talk about inductive risk. They emphasize that sometimes non-epistemic values, things not directly related to finding truth, like social or ethical concerns, are actually essential in deciding how much risk you're willing to take. This is especially true when the consequences of being wrong are really significant. For instance, if you're studying a new pesticide's effect on bees, the level of certainty you demand before concluding it's safe is influenced by how much society values protecting pollinators versus, say, agricultural output. And beyond these technical judgments, other factors creep in too. Things like where the funding is coming from, the researcher's own reputation, how famous the theory they're testing is, plus various social and psychological pressures. All these can subtly influence decisions about whether data is considered valid and how it gets interpreted.
Is there a famous example of this?
Yes, a classic historical example really brings this to life. Eddington's 1919 eclipse observation. Arthur Eddington led expeditions to observe a solar eclipse. His goal was to test Einstein's brand new theory of general relativity, which predicted that gravity, like from the sun, should bend light. Eddington collected 2 sets of photographic plates. 2 plates from an expedition in Sobral, Brazil, when analyzed, seemed to clearly confirm Einstein's prediction. But 18 other plates taken with a different telescope in Sobral seemed to contradict it, aligning more with older Newtonian predictions. And plates from Principe, another location, were kind of ambiguous due to clouds. However, Eddington was a strong believer in the elegance and correctness of Einstein's relativity, and he was a hugely respected figure in physics. So he made a choice. He argued the 18 contradictory Sobral plates were unreliable due to instrumental issues, emphasized the 2 confirming Sobral plates, and interpreted the ambiguous Principe plates as supporting relativity too. He then publicly declared the theory confirmed. His choice, undeniably influenced by his prior conviction and his scientific standing, played an absolutely pivotal role in the scientific community, rapidly accepting relativity. It was a clear case where a crucial scientific judgment, while presented technically, was also significantly shaped by deeper beliefs and reputation, making it ripe for choice-supportive bias later on.
So his belief influenced which data he trusted more.
It appears so. Next, there is the fundamental challenge of theory choice. Often, the available experimental data underdetermines a unique theory. What this means is that multiple competing, sometimes even totally incompatible, theories can all successfully explain the existing empirical observations. Think of it like drawing a curve through a set of data points. There are often many different curves you could draw that fit those points equally well. Science history is full of examples where rival theories coexisted for long periods, each explaining the known data. Ptolemaic versus Copernican models of the solar system, Newtonian versus Cartesian physics, the wave versus particle theories of light. Even today, you have interpretations like standard quantum mechanics versus Bohmian mechanics. Our sources state that these crucial choices between empirically equivalent theories aren't made solely on the data. Scientists also rely on what they call super-empirical features, or theoretical virtues. These are values. These include cognitive or epistemic values, like simplicity, accuracy, scope, consistency, fruitfulness. But critically, they also include non-cognitive or non-epistemic values, things like social utility, psychological appeal, political compatibility, even ideological factors. These non-cognitive values often play a subtle but notable and sometimes unconscious role in which theory gains acceptance. So scientists choose a theory from a set of contenders using this mix of data and values, and once that choice is made, it can become a powerful anchor, making them susceptible to CSB when defending it later.
That adds a whole other layer of complexity. What about applying science, like in technology?
Great question. In applied sciences and engineering, we see similar issues in technology design. Purely technical considerations often underdetermine the final design, meaning several different designs could potentially fulfill the required function. This forces designers to make choices based on non-technical values, whether they consciously acknowledge them or not. Think about trade-offs between cost, efficiency, safety, aesthetics, environmental impact. Furthermore, new technologies almost always have unintended consequences that are really hard to predict fully beforehand. Designers have to choose what they deem an acceptable level of risk. But defining acceptable risk is notoriously difficult. There's inherent uncertainty, stakeholders often have conflicting values, and experts might disagree with the public about the risks involved. A compelling historical example is the CFC-12 ban back in the 1990s due to ozone depletion. When the Montreal Protocol phased out CFCs, engineers needed alternatives for things like refrigerators and air conditioners. They faced this complex trade-off triangle. They needed refrigerants that were safe, not flammable or toxic, good for health, low impact from exposure, and environmentally friendly, low global warming potential. Many hydrocarbon-based gases were thermodynamically viable options, but each came with its own set of side effects and different balances of risk. For example, some were more efficient but also more flammable. Engineers had to make a choice, compromising between these often competing values. Increasing safety might decrease efficiency or increase environmental impact. It was an unavoidable choice among multiple viable options, each with different pros and cons, making it a perfect breeding ground for choice-supportive bias to set in after a particular alternative was chosen and invested in.
Okay, so choices are everywhere in science and tech. How does CSB directly impact the scientific community then?
Right, this deep dive into choice brings us squarely to the direct impact of CSB within science itself. Scientists, being human, can end up irrationally supporting their own past choices, their chosen hypotheses, methods, theories, or data interpretations. Even if those choices were perfectly reasonable or even correct at the time, irrational support later on leads to what philosophers of science call an intellectual disvalue. As the mathematician W.K. Clifford famously argued back in 1877, it is wrong always, everywhere and for anyone, to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. By extension, unreasonably defending an idea, even if the idea happens to be right, undermines the very core principle of critical inquiry that science relies on. It's about the process of belief formation.
But what if the choice was actually wrong?
That's where the consequences get much more serious. When a scientist irrationally supports a false choice, a flawed hypothesis, a misleading data interpretation, it's not just an intellectual vice that erodes the integrity of science. It leads to tangible negative outcomes. A wasteful misallocation of limited research funding and valuable researcher time-chasing dead ends. Even more critically, it can pose significant dangers to society. Imagine incorrect or misleading information about, say, disease outbreaks, the effects of climate change, or the safety of public health interventions being perpetuated simply because a researcher or a group of researchers becomes overly attached to their initial conclusions and resists contrary evidence due to CSB.
And is this always unconscious?
That's a crucial distinction. Chase supportive bias, as a cognitive bias, is fundamentally unconscious. It's an automatic mental process. However, the situation changes if a scientist consciously supports an irrational past choice, maybe after the work has been published and gained some acceptance. If they knowingly ignore strong counter-evidence or defend flawed work against legitimate criticism, that behavior arguably crosses the line from an understandable cognitive bias into a serious conflict of interest or potentially even professional misconduct. Think about a researcher who, after publishing a paper, actively dismisses or refuses to acknowledge clear shortcomings pointed out by peers and just digs in, irrationally defending their original claims. That feels different from an unconscious bias. It becomes an ethical issue that compromises scientific integrity.
Does this contribute to those big arguments we sometimes see between scientific groups?
Absolutely. This bias significantly fuels polarized research within scientific fields. In areas where there are already strong disagreements, maybe about the cause of a disease, or the best way to approach a problem, new evidence can paradoxically end up worsening the disagreement instead of helping resolve it. How? Because of the combined effects of confirmation bias, where each side actively looks for evidence supporting their view, and choice supportive bias, where they cling tightly to their past positions and choices. Scientists in each camp become more entrenched, interpreting new data through the lens of their prior commitments. This can lead to situations that some researchers describe as genuine conflicts of interest, not financial ones, but professional ones, driven by the powerful desire to defend one's intellectual investment and past choices. Our sources suggest that while disclosing financial conflicts is standard practice and important, these professional interests and the biases they generate should also be recognized and actively managed within the scientific community.
So if choices are truly baked into every stage of science, and scientists are, well, human and prone to these powerful cognitive biases, then choice supportive bias isn't just a footnote. It poses a critical, ongoing challenge to the very integrity of research. It's not just an academic point. It's a real, subtle threat to the reliability, objectivity, and ultimately the trustworthiness of the knowledge that science creates for all of us. The whole engine of scientific progress kind of depends on finding ways to overcome these internal anchors. Okay, so we've explored just how pervasive choice supportive bias is, how it shapes our memories, our decisions, even scientific progress. The big question now is, how do we actually counteract this powerful force? What can we do to mitigate its effects, both in our own personal lives, where it nudges our daily choices, and maybe even more critically within the scientific community, where the whole goal is objective truth?
Right, that's the crucial next step. Let's start with some really practical, general strategies for mitigation. These are things that can apply broadly, whether you're making a personal decision or a professional one. The very first step, and honestly it's fundamental, is simply awareness of the bias. Just knowing that choice-supportive bias exists, understanding how it works, recognizing how it can subtly twist your memory and perception, that alone is the foundation for countering its effects. It helps bring an unconscious process into conscious thought.
So just knowing about it helps.
It's the starting point. Another really effective strategy is pre-decisional accountability. What this means is, before you make a big decision, especially one with significant consequences, commit yourself to explaining your reasoning, your pros, your cons, how you evaluated the alternatives to someone else, a neutral third party if possible. This commitment to explain externally tends to encourage a more detailed, thorough, and objective evaluation internally, because you know you'll have to articulate and defend your thought process. It fosters a more rigorous review before the choice gets locked in.
Okay, like forcing yourself to justify it beforehand, not just afterwards.
Exactly. Then there's a neat mental trick called prospective hindsight. You basically imagine that the decision you're about to make has already been made and it turned out to be a complete failure. By mentally fast-forwarding to a negative outcome, it can help you uncover potential flaws, unforeseen risks, or maybe overlooked alternatives that you might have initially dismissed in your optimism. Similarly, actively consider the opposite. Deliberately make the case against your initial preferred choice. Force yourself to argue for the alternatives. This helps uncover merits you might have ignored and can significantly weaken that initial bias towards your favorite option. It's about consciously seeking out the disconfirming evidence.
Like playing devil's advocate with yourself.
Precisely. And in situations where it's actually feasible, blind analysis can be incredibly powerful. Try to assess the options without knowing which one you initially preferred or which one you might have a vested interest in. This pushes for a fairer assessment based purely on the merits, uncolored by your pre-existing leanings. For example, a business leader could evaluate new project proposals with the team names removed. That helps mitigate bias towards a favored team or a pet project.
That makes sense. What else?
Implementing robust feedback loops is also really vital, especially for long-term improvement. You need clear, objective ways to get feedback on the outcomes of your decisions, particularly those decisions where CSB might have played a role. Getting consistent feedback helps you recognize your own patterns of bias over time, allowing you to adjust and refine your approach. Equally important is fostering diversity of thought. Actively bring people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different expertise into your decision-making process. Their varied insights can powerfully challenge your own inherent biases and broaden your viewpoint, helping you see things you might miss on your own. A project manager, for instance, might deliberately include team members from engineering, marketing, and customer service to get diverse input on a new product, ensuring no single, potentially biased perspective dominates the discussion.
So get outside perspectives.
Yes. And documentation of reasons is a simple but surprisingly effective technique. Before you make a significant choice, actually write down your reasons for picking that option and your reasons for rejecting the others. Then, sometime after the decision is made, revisit it and write down your reasons again. Comparing those two lists later can vividly highlight any post-decision rationalizations or distortions that have subtly crept in. It gives you concrete evidence of the bias in action. Paired with this, regular review of past decisions looking back at their outcomes objectively against your initial documented reasons helps you identify if you have consistent biases in your decision-making over time.
Okay, documenting seems key. Any other personal strategies?
Well, before a decision, really engage in thorough pre-decision analysis. List the pros and cons for all the serious options as neutrally as possible, without letting your preference leak in too early. And after, conduct honest post-decision reflection. Ask yourself, did the outcome really match what I expected? What factors did I overlook or maybe downplay because of bias? And finally, maybe the most important thing for personal growth, embrace mistakes. Accept that not every decision will be perfect. Learning from errors, analyzing them objectively, and adapting your future approach is far more productive than endlessly justifying them. It leads to genuinely better decision-making skills. And alongside all this, just continuous learning about decision-making processes and cognitive biases themselves equips you with better mental tools to fight these distortions. It makes you a more aware and hopefully more effective decision-maker.
That does sound like a real commitment, almost like a mental discipline. But you can see how essential it would be for making better choices. Okay, now let's shift back to science. How does the scientific community specifically try to address this? And based on the research, what more could be done, especially given how critical objectivity is there?
Right. So the scientific community does currently have several important control processes in place that aim to mitigate various biases, and these indirectly help with choice-supportive bias too. Collaboration is fundamental. Working with other researchers naturally helps identify individual blind spots and forces you to justify your assumptions to others. Data sharing policies are increasingly common, promoting transparency and allowing other scientists to scrutinize analyses and potentially catch issues. Peer review before publication is obviously a cornerstone. Having anonymous experts critically evaluate research is designed to catch flaws and challenge weak arguments. And the very act of publication itself subjects the findings to wider critique from the entire global scientific community, opening the door for post-publication review, replication attempts, and ongoing debate.
But you said earlier these might not be enough.
Exactly. Our sources strongly emphasize that these current controls, while absolutely necessary, have significant limitations, especially when it comes to fully neutralizing something as subtle and pervasive as choice-supportive bias. For instance, actual replication of scientific studies is often quite selective and technically difficult. It's just not practical, sometimes not even possible, to perfectly reconstruct every single observation, every nuanced methodological choice, every theoretical assumption made by the original researchers. This limits how thoroughly past choices can be reevaluated. Furthermore, peer review can struggle in highly polarized fields, areas where researchers are already divided into camps. In those situations, reviewers might be biased by their own prior commitments, and it becomes hard for the system to dislodge entrenched viewpoints, even if they're partly fueled by CSB. Each side might just keep publishing results supporting their view. So while these methods are indispensable, the conclusion for the research we looked at is pretty clear. They are not enough for choice-supportive bias mitigation on their own.
Okay, so if the current safety nets have holes, what new strategies are being proposed? What does the research suggest for the future to really strengthen scientific integrity against CSB?
This leads us to three really interesting, quite specific proposed mitigation methods in science policy, drawn directly from that accountability and research paper. The first one is quite radical, actually, giving more scores or credit to self-criticism publications. The core idea is that research institutions, funding agencies, maybe even journals, could explicitly allocate more scores, professional credit, impact points to new articles where a researcher systematically critiques and reevaluates their own previously published work, especially if they identify limitations, potential biases, or areas where their initial choices might have been suboptimal in hindsight. The potential benefits are huge. It powerfully encourages self-awareness and fosters genuine open-mindedness, which are absolutely crucial intellectual virtues for scientists. It could also save the community immense time and resources by having the original researcher, who knows the work best, proactively identify weaknesses. Now, you might worry this could incentivize researchers to find flaws just to get points. But the argument is that the incentives would need careful calibration. And scientists' reputations are built on credibility, so they're unlikely to fabricate criticisms just for scores. Genuine, insightful self-critique would be what's valued. This policy could signal a major cultural shift, valuing humility and critical self-reflection right alongside discovery.
That's a fascinating idea. Rewarding people for finding flaws in their own work. What's the second proposal?
The second method focuses on timing, recording the experiment shortcomings by the researcher before publishing. The insight here is that focusing only on information after a choice is made, especially after the big commitment of publishing, really ramps up CSB. The scientist naturally feels compelled to defend their published work. So the proposal is to proactively record pre-choice information specifically. The weaknesses, the limitations, the tricky assumptions, the alternative interpretations that were considered before the final commitment to the findings. The mechanism could involve keeping unchangeable, maybe time-stamped notes of these limitations as part of the official scientific documentation, like lab notebooks or supplementary files. The potential benefit is profound. These notes could potentially be made available to other researchers later on, providing crucial context. This would enable more efficient, more informed critiques and follow-up studies because the original challenges and uncertainties would be preserved, not potentially glossed over or forgotten due to post-choice rationalization. It's about creating a more honest, comprehensive record of the scientific journey, warts and all, not just the polished final destination.
So documenting the doubts and caveats up front. That makes sense. And the third one?
The third, and arguably the one with the broadest potential impact, is emphasizing control processes before researcher choices in scientific inquiry. While science has lots of checks and balances throughout the process, the argument here is that the most effective way to mitigate CSB is to implement stronger controls at the pre-choice stages before the researcher gets too invested, emotionally or professionally, in a particular hypothesis, method, or expected outcome. One really powerful tool for this, which is gaining traction, is pre-registering study plans, often implemented through registered reports. With registered reports, the researchers submit their entire methodology, their research question, hypotheses, experimental design, data collection plan, and crucially, their planned statistical analysis for peer review before they collect any data. If the peer reviewers deem the methodology sound and important, the journal accepts the article in principle for publication, regardless of what the results eventually show, even if the findings are null, negative, or unexpected. This is incredibly powerful because it completely changes the incentive structure. It disconnects the publication outcome from the perceived success or desirability of the results. It prevents the researcher's unconscious bias from creeping into how they analyze or report the data based on whether they like the outcome. The focus shifts squarely onto rigorous, unbiased methodology, which is exactly what you want for reliable science.
So the decision to publish is made before the results are even known.
Exactly. Another potential avenue under this third strategy is advocating for a period of confidentiality for scientific data and findings, at least under certain circumstances. Right now, there's often immense pressure on researchers to publish data immediately to claim priority, get credit, stay competitive. But the paper points out that responsible conduct of research already necessitates confidentiality, sometimes, for example, while pursuing a patent or due to contractual obligations with funders. The new rationale proposed here is specifically for mitigating CSB. A short, structured period of confidentiality after an experiment is completed, but before the findings are formally confirmed or widely shared, could give researchers a crucial window. A window to meticulously recheck their data, reconsider their interpretations, maybe run alternative analyses without the pressure of public commitment. The idea is compelling. Researchers might find it much easier to criticize their own work, spot flaws, or accept mistakes before they've formally nailed their flag to the mast by publishing or presenting. This period, even if brief, could offer a structured pause for objectivity, fostering critical self-reflection before the choice-supportive bias really locks in post-commitment.
This really sounds like it's about fostering a fundamental culture shift, doesn't it? A culture of more critical thinking, more genuine openness to being wrong, both within ourselves as individuals and across the whole scientific community. It's about ensuring decisions get made through a more balanced, objective lens, not just driven by that unconscious urge to justify what we've already done or defend beliefs we're attached to or protect our professional investments. It's like acknowledging that being human means we will be biased, but we can build better systems to help us overcome it. Hashtag tag tag outro boredom. So after that deep dive into choice supportive bias, what really stands out to you? It seems so clear that this isn't just some, quirky human tendency or a minor glitch in our thinking. It feels like a profound, really subtle force. It's constantly shaping our perceptions, influencing how we remember things, guiding our actions. From the brands we choose at the supermarket to the relationships we invest in, all the way up to the scientific theories and technologies that shape our world. It really highlights how much our internal story needs to feel consistent, sometimes even more than it needs to be accurate.
Absolutely. And I think understanding choice-supportive bias isn't about, beating ourselves up for past choices or pointing fingers at others for being biased. That's not helpful. Instead, it's really about recognizing these invisible but incredibly powerful forces that are always subtly guiding how we think and remember. And that knowledge, that awareness, it empowers us. It empowers us to cultivate greater self-awareness, to encourage more rigorous critical thinking, both in ourselves and in others, and to constantly strive for decisions that are more objective, more genuinely informed. And this effort, this cultivation of intellectual honesty, is just especially vital in fields like science, where the integrity, the reliability, and ultimately the value of the research to society fundamentally depend on scientists finding ways to overcome these subtle cognitive hurdles. It's really an ongoing process of self-improvement and maintaining scientific integrity.
So, thinking about this for you, the listener, what does this all mean in your day-to-day life? Maybe the next time you find yourself really strongly defending a past decision, perhaps you feel that little irrational tug, that slight defensiveness bubbling up when someone questions it. Or maybe you notice someone else doing the exact same thing. Just take a moment, pause, ask yourself, is this really an objective assessment of the situation based purely on the facts as they were back then? Or is choice supportive bias maybe, just maybe, subtly anchoring my perspective, twisting my memory a bit, influencing my judgment, just to protect a choice I already made? And for your final provocative thought to maybe mull over, if our memories are constantly being reshaped, edited, influenced by the choices we've already made, then how much of what we consider truth about our own lives, about our past decisions, maybe even about our own identities, how much of that is actually a carefully constructed narrative, a story designed specifically to protect our self-perception, to make us feel consistent and rational? And what would it actually take for us to see our past decisions and therefore our present realities with truly unbiased eyes, even if looking clearly challenges those comfortable ego-boosting stories we like to tell ourselves? Join us next time on The Deep Dive.